The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of Buckingham Palace. Thomas Morgan stood perfectly still at his post, his red uniform pressed without a single wrinkle, his tall black bearskin hat firmly in place. He had been a royal guard for nearly 15 years, and standing motionless for hours had become second nature to him. Tourists gathered around, taking photographs and trying to make him smile or react. Thomas stared straight ahead, his face like stone, just as he had been trained. This was his life. Every day the same routine. Wake up at 5 in the morning, put on the uniform that weighed nearly 40 pounds, and stand guard at one of the most famous landmarks in the world. People came from every corner of the globe to see him and his fellow guards. They made jokes, took silly pictures, and sometimes even tried to touch the guards. Thomas had seen it all. Nothing surprised him anymore, but today would be different. Today, something would happen that would shake the very foundation of everything Thomas believed about duty, honor, and service. The day started like any other Wednesday. Thomas arrived at the palace gates, went through security, and joined his unit for the morning briefing. Captain Reynolds, a stern man with silver hair and a voice that could cut through steel, addressed the guards as he did every morning. "Gentlemen, remember your training. You represent the crown. You represent centuries of tradition. No matter what happens, you remain at your post. You do not move. You do not speak. You do not react. Is that understood?" "Yes, sir," the guards responded in unison. Thomas took his position at the east entrance, the spot he had occupied hundreds of times before. The summer heat was already building, promising a sweltering day ahead. His uniform felt heavier than usual, or perhaps he was just tired. He had not slept well the night before. Strange dreams had troubled him, though he could not remember what they were about. The morning passed slowly. Tour groups came and went. A man from Japan bowed respectfully before taking a photograph. A family from America let their children pose next to Thomas, the little ones giggling with excitement. An elderly couple from France simply smiled and moved on, understanding the solemnity of the guard's duty. Around 11 o'clock, things began to change. Thomas noticed increased activity near the main palace entrance. Black cars with tinted windows arrived one after another. Security personnel moved with purpose, speaking into their earpieces. Something was happening, though Thomas had no idea what it might be. Then he heard it. The sound of children's voices, bright and cheerful. Through his peripheral vision, without moving his eyes, Thomas could see a small group approaching. There were adults in formal attire, security officers, and in the middle of it all, several children. His training told him not to look directly, not to acknowledge, not to react. But then one small voice rose above the others. "Look, that's a real palace guard. Can we say hello?" Thomas recognized that voice immediately. Everyone in Britain would. It was Prince George, the young heir to the throne. The boy was about 10 years old now, no longer the toddler the public had first met years ago, but still innocent and full of wonder. "Guards are on duty, George. We mustn't disturb them," came the gentle reply from Catherine, the Princess of Wales. The group began to pass by. Thomas remained frozen, his eyes fixed on the middle distance, his breathing steady and controlled. This was just another moment. Just another day. Royals passed by guards all the time. There was nothing unusual about this. But then it happened. Small footsteps stopped directly in front of Thomas. He could see the child in his peripheral vision, standing there looking up at him with curiosity. Prince George had broken away from his group and was now standing barely 2 feet from Thomas. "Do you get tired?" the young prince asked. His voice was sincere, genuinely concerned. Standing there all day must be very hard. Thomas did not move. He could not move. 15 years of training held him in place like an iron grip, but inside something stirred. No one had ever asked him that before. Thousands of people had passed by, taken photos, made jokes, but no one had ever stopped to wonder if he was tired. "George, come along," his mother called gently. But the young prince did not move. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled something out. It was a small bottle of water, still cold with condensation on the outside. "It's really hot today," Prince George said, his voice soft and kind. "I thought you might be thirsty. I know you can't move or talk, but maybe you can take this after, when you're done." The child carefully placed the water bottle on the ground at Thomas's feet, positioning it gently as if it were something precious. Then he looked up one more time at the guard's face. "Thank you for protecting everyone," Prince George said. "I know it's hard work. Thomas felt something crack inside his chest. It was not pain exactly, but something else, something he had not felt in many years. His eyes, trained to remain fixed and unblinking, suddenly felt warm. A small sting of emotion that he immediately tried to suppress. The young prince smiled, gave a small wave, and ran back to his mother. The group continued on their way, disappearing around the corner of the palace. The courtyard returned to its normal rhythm. Tourists resumed their photographs. Birds sang in the nearby trees. Everything went back to normal. Everything except Thomas. He stood there for another 3 hours, completing his shift as required. But the entire time his mind was not on his duty. It was on those simple words from a child. "Do you get tired?" Nobody had asked him that in 15 years. Nobody had cared. The water bottle sat at his feet, warming in the sun. Thomas stared straight ahead, but in his mind he was somewhere else entirely. He was thinking about his own childhood, about dreams he had forgotten, about the reasons he had joined the Guard in the first place. He was thinking about his father, who had died when Thomas was young, and how his father had always told him that true strength was not about being hard, but about being kind. When his shift finally ended and the replacement guard took his position, Thomas bent down and picked up the water bottle. It was warm now, no longer cold, but he held it like it was made of gold. As he walked back through the palace corridors to change out of his uniform, Thomas felt different. Something had shifted inside him. A simple act of kindness from a 10-year-old boy had reached through 15 years of rigid training and touched something human, something real. He did not know it yet, but this moment would change everything. This small interaction would set in motion a series of events that would lead Thomas to question everything he had believed about duty, honor, and what it truly meant to serve. Thomas sat on the bench in the changing room, still holding the water bottle. Around him, other guards were removing their uniforms, chatting about their day, making plans for the evening. The room buzzed with the usual conversation, but Thomas heard none of it. His mind was somewhere else entirely. "You all right, Morgan?" asked David Fletcher, a fellow guard who had joined the unit around the same time as Thomas. David was buttoning his civilian shirt, preparing to head home to his family. Thomas looked up, startled from his thoughts. "Yeah, just tired, I suppose." David laughed. "Aren't we all? This heat is killing me. My wife wants to go out tonight, but all I want to do is sit in front of a fan." He grabbed his bag and headed toward the door. "See you tomorrow, mate." "See you," Thomas replied automatically. But Thomas did not go home right away. Instead, he sat there for nearly 30 minutes just thinking. The water bottle was now at room temperature, but he still had not opened it. Something about drinking it felt too final, like it would end whatever spell had been cast over him that morning. Finally, he stood up, changed into his street clothes, and walked out of the palace. The evening air was cooler now, and London was settling into its twilight rhythm. People rushed past him on the sidewalks, heading to dinners, meetings, theaters. Everyone had somewhere to be, something to do. Thomas walked slowly, in no hurry to reach his small apartment in South London. He lived alone. He had lived alone for nearly 8 years, ever since his marriage had fallen apart. Sarah had tried to understand his commitment to the Guard, tried to accept the long hours and the emotional distance that came with the job, but eventually she had given up. "You're married to that uniform, not to me," she had said the day she left. Thomas had not argued. He had not known how to argue. She was right. When he finally reached his apartment, Thomas unlocked the door and stepped into the familiar silence. The place was clean but sparse. A sofa, a television, a small kitchen table. There were no photographs on the walls, no personal touches that made it feel like a home. It was just a place to sleep between shifts. He set the water bottle on the kitchen counter and stared at it. Such a simple thing. Just a plastic bottle with water inside, but it represented something much bigger. It represented the fact that someone had seen him. Really seen him. Not as a statue or a tourist attraction, but as a human being who might be hot and tired and thirsty. Thomas opened his laptop, something he rarely did. He was not much for technology or social media, but tonight he felt compelled to search for something. He typed into the search bar, "Royal Guards Mental Health." The result surprised him. Article after article appeared talking about the pressure guards faced. The physical strain of standing motionless for hours, the mental challenge of being treated like an object, the difficulty of maintaining personal relationships, the high rates of stress and depression among ceremonial soldiers. Thomas had never thought about it this way before. He had always seen his struggles as personal failings, weaknesses he needed to overcome. But here was evidence that others felt the same way. He was not alone in his experience. One article included interviews with former guards. Thomas read them carefully, his heart beating faster with each paragraph. "I loved serving my country, but I lost myself in the process," one former guard had said. "I forgot how to be human. I forgot how to feel." Another wrote, "The hardest part was not the physical demands. It was the emotional shutdown. You train yourself not to react, not to feel, and eventually you can't turn it back on, not even for the people you love." Thomas closed the laptop and walked to his bedroom. On his dresser was an old photograph, one of the few personal items he had kept. It showed him as a young man, maybe 22 years old, smiling broadly with his arm around his father. His father had been so proud when Thomas joined the Guard. "You'll be protecting the Queen herself," he had said with tears in his eyes. "Our family will have such an honor." But his father had died before he could see Thomas in his full uniform. A heart attack, sudden and devastating. Thomas had been in basic training at the time. He remembered standing at attention during the funeral, his face expressionless even as his mother wept. Even then, he had been practicing his guard face, even at his own father's funeral. The next morning, Thomas returned to the palace, but something felt different. As he put on his uniform and took his position, he became aware of things he had never noticed before. The way his body ached after just an hour of standing, the way his mind went numb to deal with the monotony, the way he had to disconnect from his own humanity to perform his duty. The tourists came as always. A group of teenagers from Spain made funny faces at him, trying to get a reaction. A woman from China bowed respectfully before taking a picture. A man from Australia said loudly to his friend, "I bet they're not even real. Probably just wax figures." Each interaction chipped away at something inside Thomas. He had never felt this awareness before, this consciousness of what he was giving up. For 15 years he had turned off this part of himself. But Prince George's simple kindness had flipped a switch, and Thomas could not turn it off again. During his lunch break, Thomas did something he had never done before. Instead of eating alone in the guards' quarters, he walked to the palace gardens where staff often gathered. He sat on a bench and watched people interact. A gardener laughed with a maintenance worker. Two young women from the administrative office shared sandwiches and gossip. A security officer played a game on his phone while eating his lunch. They all looked so human, so alive. They laughed and talked and showed emotion. Thomas realized he had forgotten how to do those things. He had trained himself to be a statue, and he had succeeded too well. "Mind if I sit?" asked a voice. Thomas looked up to see James O'Connor, one of the palace historians. James was in his 60s with kind eyes and a gentle manner. He had worked at the palace for over 40 years. "Please," Thomas said, moving over slightly. James sat down with a soft groan. "These old bones don't work like they used to." He unwrapped his sandwich and took a bite, then looked at Thomas curiously. "I've seen you around for years, but I don't think we've ever properly met." "James O'Connor. Thomas Morgan, Royal Guard, yes?" "I can always tell. You all have a certain bearing even out of uniform." Thomas nodded but said nothing. James seemed to sense something. "You look troubled, if you don't mind me saying." "Everything all right?" Thomas hesitated. He was not used to talking about personal matters, especially not with strangers. But something about James's kind face made him want to speak. "Do you ever wonder," Thomas began slowly, "if we give up too much? In service, I mean." James considered the question carefully. "That's a profound question. What brought this on?" Thomas told him about Prince George and the water bottle. As he spoke, he expected James to laugh or dismiss it as trivial. But the old historian listened carefully, nodding occasionally. When Thomas finished, James was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You know, I've studied the history of the Royal Guard for decades. The tradition goes back centuries. But here's something most people don't know. The guards used to be different. Back in the old days, they were soldiers first, ceremonial figures second. They talked to people. They smiled occasionally. The rigid statue-like performance is actually a relatively modern invention, created for the tourists and the cameras." Thomas felt something shift in his understanding. "So it wasn't always like this?" "No, the humanity was always there. We just forgot about it." James stood up, brushing crumbs from his lap. You know what I think? I think that young prince reminded you of something important. Something we all need to remember. Duty is important, yes. But so is kindness. So is compassion. So is remembering that we're human beings first and everything else second. As James walked away, Thomas sat there in the garden, feeling the warm sun on his face. For the first time in 15 years, he allowed himself to really feel it. The warmth, the breeze, the sounds of life around him. He was waking up from a long sleep, and the world looked different now. Brighter somehow, more real. The days following his conversation with James O'Connor felt strange to Thomas. It was as if someone had removed a blindfold he had been wearing for years. He saw things differently now. The palace, which had always been just his workplace, now seemed like a prison of tradition. The uniform, which had once made him proud, now felt like a costume that hid who he really was. On Friday morning, Thomas stood at his usual post. A school group arrived, led by an enthusiastic teacher, who was explaining the history of the Royal Guard to the children. The kids listened with wide eyes, impressed by the tall soldiers in their red uniforms. "These brave men protect the royal family," the teacher said. "They stand here for hours without moving, no matter what happens. They are like the strongest soldiers in the world." One little girl raised her hand. "Don't their feet hurt?" The teacher laughed. "I'm sure they do, but these guards are trained to ignore pain." "They're trained to be tough," Thomas wanted to speak. He wanted to tell that little girl, yes, his feet hurt terribly. Yes, his back ached. Yes, sometimes he felt dizzy from standing so long in the heat. But he remained silent, frozen in place, playing the role expected of him. After the school group left, Thomas noticed something that made his heart sink. An elderly man was walking toward the palace entrance, moving slowly with a cane. The man stumbled slightly, catching himself just before falling. He looked around, clearly shaken, but no one seemed to notice. Tourists walked past him, focused on taking pictures. Other visitors hurried by, caught up in their own experiences. The old man steadied himself and continued walking, but Thomas could see the fear in his eyes. He had almost fallen. He was walking alone. He needed help. Every instinct in Thomas screamed at him to move, to step forward and ask if the man was all right. But his training held him back. Do not move. Do not speak. Do not break position. Those rules had been drilled into him for 15 years. They were absolute. The elderly man disappeared into the crowd, and Thomas stood there frozen, feeling sick to his stomach. He had just watched someone who needed help, and he had done nothing. The uniform had made him watch a human being in need without responding. What kind of person had he become? That evening, Thomas could not eat dinner. He sat in his apartment staring at the wall, replaying the scene over and over in his mind. He thought about Prince George's kindness. He thought about James's words about humanity. He thought about that elderly man who had stumbled and needed help. He picked up his phone and dialed a number he had not called in 2 years. It rang 4 times before a familiar voice answered. "Hello?" "Sarah," Thomas said quietly. "It's me." There was a long pause. Sarah, his ex-wife, finally spoke. "Thomas, is everything all right?" I don't know. Can we talk?" Another pause. "Okay, when?" "Tomorrow, coffee?" "All right." "The usual place?" 10 o'clock. Thomas hardly slept that night. He kept thinking about what he would say to Sarah, about how to explain what was happening inside him. How do you tell someone that you're just now realizing you've been living like a robot for 15 years? Saturday morning arrived with gray clouds and the threat of rain. Thomas dressed in casual clothes and made his way to the small cafe where he and Sarah used to meet during their marriage. It was in a quiet neighborhood, away from the tourist areas, with mismatched furniture and artwork from local artists on the walls. Sarah was already there when he arrived. She looked older, but in a good way, more confident. Her hair was shorter now, and she wore glasses he had never seen before. She smiled nervously when she saw him. "Hi," she said. "Hi." Thomas sat down across from her. "Thanks for meeting me." "Of course. You sounded different on the phone. Is something wrong?" "Where to begin?" Thomas ordered a coffee from the waitress, then turned back to Sarah. "Something happened this week. Something small, but it made me realize." He struggled to find the right words. "I think I've been asleep for a very long time." Sarah tilted her head, listening carefully. Thomas told her everything. About Prince George and the water bottle. About the elderly man who stumbled. About the conversation with James. about how he suddenly saw himself clearly for the first time in years and he did not like what he saw. "I turned into the uniform," Thomas said quietly. "I stopped being Thomas and became just a guard. I can't even remember when it happened. But I lost myself somewhere along the way." Sarah reached across the table and touched his hand gently. It was the first time they had touched in years. "I'm glad you're seeing this. But Thomas, I have to be honest with you. This isn't new. This is who you've been for as long as I've known you. Even before we got married, you were so focused on duty and honor that you forgot about everything else. Including yourself. Including me." The words hurt, but Thomas knew they were true. "You tried to tell me, didn't you?" "I just wouldn't listen." "You couldn't listen. You were so locked into being the perfect soldier that nothing else could get through." Sarah squeezed his hand. "But maybe now you're ready to hear it. Maybe that little boy's kindness was exactly what you needed." They talked for 2 hours. Sarah told him about her life now. She had remarried to a teacher named David who made her laugh and remembered her birthday. She seemed happy, truly happy, in a way she had never been with Thomas. "I don't regret our time together," Sarah said, "but I also don't regret moving on. I needed someone who was present, who was there emotionally. You were always so far away, even when you were standing right next to me." "I'm sorry," Thomas said, and he meant it deeply. "I'm sorry I wasn't the husband you deserved." Sarah smiled sadly. "I know you are, and I forgive you. But Thomas, you need to forgive yourself too. You need to figure out who you are underneath that uniform, because that's the real work ahead of you." When they parted ways outside the cafe, Sarah hugged him tightly. "Good luck, Thomas." "I mean that. I hope you find what you're looking for." Thomas walked through London for hours that day, just thinking. He walked past the Thames, through parks, down streets he had never explored before. He watched people living their lives. A father teaching his daughter to ride a bicycle. A young couple holding hands and laughing. An old woman feeding pigeons in the park. Life was happening all around him and he had been missing it. For 15 years he had been so focused on standing still that he had forgotten how to move forward. By the time Thomas returned to his apartment that evening, he knew what he had to do. The realization had been building since Prince George placed that water bottle at his feet, but now it was crystal clear. He could not continue being a royal guard, not like this, not anymore. The decision terrified him. Being a guard was his entire identity. It was what made him special, what gave him purpose. Without the uniform, who was he? Just Thomas Morgan, a man approaching 40 with no real relationships and no clear path forward. But staying would be worse. Staying would mean continuing to shut down his humanity every single day. Staying would mean watching people in need and doing nothing. Staying would mean living as a statue instead of a human being. Thomas sat at his kitchen table and pulled out a piece of paper. He began writing, crossing out words, starting over. He was writing a letter of resignation, something he never thought he would do. The words came slowly at first, then faster as his conviction grew stronger. After an hour, he had a draft. It was honest and respectful. It thanked the Guard for 15 years of service. It acknowledged the honor of serving the crown. But it also explained, as best as Thomas could, that he needed to step away. That he needed to find himself again. That he needed to remember how to be human. He read it over 3 times, making small changes. When he was satisfied, he folded the letter carefully and placed it in an envelope. Tomorrow was Sunday, his day off. On Monday, he would submit his resignation to Captain Reynolds. The thought made his hands shake. Captain Reynolds would be disappointed. His fellow guards would be shocked. After 15 years of perfect service, Thomas Morgan was walking away. But as Thomas sat there in his quiet apartment, he felt something he had not felt in years. He felt free. Scared, yes. Uncertain, absolutely, but free. The chains of duty and tradition were loosening, and he could almost breathe again. Sunday passed in a blur of nervous energy. Thomas tried to watch television but could not focus. He attempted to read a book but found himself reading the same page over and over without comprehending the words. His mind was consumed with what would happen tomorrow when he submitted his resignation letter. He kept picking up the envelope, holding it, questioning his decision. Was he making a huge mistake? The Royal Guard had been his entire adult life. It provided him with purpose, structure, respect. People looked at him differently when they learned he was a Royal Guard. He was somebody. Without the uniform, would he become nobody? But then he would remember the elderly man stumbling, remember standing there unable to help, and his resolve would strengthen. He would remember Prince George's simple act of kindness and realize that somewhere along the way, he had forgotten how to show that same kindness himself. That night, Thomas barely slept. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, watching shadows move across the walls as cars passed outside. His alarm was set for 5 in the morning, the same time he had been waking up for 15 years. But tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow, everything would change. When morning finally came, Thomas went through his routine mechanically. Shower, shave, uniform. But as he buttoned the red tunic and placed the bearskin hat on his head, each movement felt heavy with meaning. This might be one of the last times he would wear this uniform. The thought made his chest tight with emotion. He carefully placed the resignation letter in his inside pocket, right over his heart. Then he made his way to Buckingham Palace, walking the same route he had walked thousands of times before. London was just waking up. Delivery trucks rumbled through the streets. Early morning joggers passed by. The city was coming to life, and Thomas felt like he was seeing it clearly for the first time. At the palace, he went through security and headed to the guard quarters. Several of his fellow guards were already there, preparing for the day. They greeted him with the usual nods and brief words. These men were the closest thing Thomas had to friends, yet he realized he knew almost nothing about their personal lives. They had spent 15 years working side by side, but always at a distance, always professional, never truly connecting. Captain Reynolds appeared in the doorway, his posture rigid as always. "Morning briefing in 5 minutes, gentlemen." Thomas's heart pounded. This was it. After the briefing, he would request a private word with the captain and submit his letter. There was no turning back now. The briefing was routine. Captain Reynolds discussed the day's schedule, reminded everyone of their positions, reviewed protocol. Thomas heard the words, but they seemed to come from far away, like he was underwater. His hand unconsciously moved to his chest, feeling the envelope beneath his uniform. "Dismissed," Captain Reynolds said finally. The other guards began filing out. Thomas stood, his legs feeling weak. "Captain Reynolds, sir? Might I have a word?" The captain looked up from his notes. "Morgan, yes, of course. What is it?" The room emptied. Thomas and Captain Reynolds stood facing each other. The captain was a formidable man, respected and feared in equal measure. He had served in the military for 30 years before taking this position. He represented everything the Royal Guard stood for: discipline, honor, unwavering commitment. Thomas pulled the envelope from his pocket. His hand trembled slightly as he held it out. "Sir, I need to submit my resignation." Captain Reynolds stared at the envelope without taking it. The silence stretched out, becoming almost unbearable. Finally, the captain spoke, his voice carefully controlled. "Resignation? You've been with us for 15 years, Morgan. You're one of our most reliable men. What's happened?" Thomas struggled to find words that would make sense. "I need to step away, sir. I've realized that this life isn't for me anymore." "This life." Captain Reynolds repeated the words slowly. "Morgan, this isn't just a life. This is a calling. This is service to the crown. You swore an oath." "I know, sir, and I've honored that oath for 15 years. But I can't continue." "Not anymore," the captain's face hardened. "You can't continue? Do you know how many men would give anything for the position you hold? Do you understand what you're throwing away?" "Yes, sir. But I've lost myself in this role. I need to find out who I am without the uniform." Captain Reynolds took the envelope, but his expression was one of disappointment and anger. "I must say, Morgan, I'm shocked. I thought you understood what it meant to be a guard. This is about something larger than yourself. This is about tradition, about honor, about representing something greater." "I do understand that, sir, and I'm grateful for everything the Guard has given me. But I also understand now that I've sacrificed too much. I've become so focused on representing something greater that I've forgotten how to be human." "Human?" The captain's voice rose slightly. "You think the rest of us aren't human? You think we don't make sacrifices? That's what service means, Morgan. Sacrifice, putting duty before personal comfort." Thomas met his gaze steadily. "With respect, sir, I think there's a difference between sacrifice and self-destruction. I've spent 15 years turning off my emotions, ignoring my needs, disconnecting from everyone around me. That's not service. That's just emptiness." Captain Reynolds was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was softer but still stern. "I'll process your resignation. You'll need to serve a 2-week notice period. During that time, I expect you to maintain the same standards you always have. Whatever personal crisis you're experiencing, you'll keep it separate from your duty. Understood? Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. Dismissed. Thomas left the office feeling strange. Relief mixed with regret, freedom mixed with fear. He had done it. After 15 years, he was walking away from the Royal Guard. The thought was both exhilarating and terrifying. He took his position at his usual post, but everything felt different now. The uniform that had once made him proud now felt like a burden. The tourists who gathered around seemed to look right through him, seeing the uniform but not the man inside it. For 2 more weeks he would stand here, playing this role one final time. Around mid-morning, Thomas noticed a familiar figure approaching. James O'Connor, the palace historian, was walking through the courtyard with a group of visitors, giving them a tour. When James spotted Thomas, he smiled and nodded slightly. It was a small gesture, barely noticeable, but it meant everything to Thomas in that moment. Someone saw him. Someone recognized him as a person, not just a statue. The day dragged on. Thomas's mind wandered constantly. He thought about what he would do after he left the guard. He had some savings, enough to live on for a few months while he figured things out. But then what? He had no other skills, no other training. Being a royal guard was all he knew. During his lunch break, Thomas sat alone in the guard quarters. The other men were talking about a football match, debating which team would win. Thomas listened to their conversation but did not join in. He felt separate from them now, like he was already gone even though he was still physically present. David Fletcher noticed his silence. "You all right, Morgan? You've been quiet all morning." "Just thinking," Thomas replied. "About what?" Thomas hesitated. Should he tell them? Would they understand, or would they judge him as Captain Reynolds had? He decided to be honest. "I've submitted my resignation. 2 weeks from now I'll be done." The room went silent. All the other guards turned to look at him. The shock on their faces was clear. "You're joking," David said. "After 15 years, you're just walking away?" "Yes, but why? What happened?" Thomas thought about how to explain. "I just realized that this isn't the life I want anymore. I need something different, something more." Another guard, a younger man named Peter, shook his head. "I don't understand. This is the best job in the world. We're part of history. We're part of something important." "Maybe it's the best job for you," Thomas said gently. "But it's not right for me anymore." The mood in the room shifted. Some of the guards looked confused, others looked angry. Thomas understood. His decision challenged everything they believed about the guard, about duty, about service. If Thomas could walk away after 15 years, what did that say about their own choices? David stood up abruptly and left the room without another word. The others gradually returned to their conversations, but the easy atmosphere from before was gone. Thomas had become an outsider in the span of a few minutes. The 2 weeks of Thomas's notice period felt like the longest of his life. Each day he put on the uniform knowing he was counting down to his final shift. The other guards treated him differently now. Some avoided him entirely, as if his decision to leave was contagious. Others made pointed comments about loyalty and commitment. Only a few, like James O'Connor, continued to treat him with kindness and understanding. On his 5th day after submitting his resignation, something unexpected happened. Thomas was at his post when he noticed a journalist approaching with a photographer. This was not unusual. Media representatives often covered events at the palace, but this journalist walked straight up to Thomas, stopping just a few feet away. "Excuse me," she said, her voice professional but curious. "I'm Rebecca Walsh from The Guardian. I understand you're leaving the Royal Guard after 15 years. Would you be willing to speak with me after your shift?" Thomas remained motionless, staring straight ahead as protocol demanded. But inside his mind raced. How had she found out? Who had told her? His resignation was supposed to be an internal matter. Rebecca seemed to understand his position. "I know you can't respond right now, but I'll be at the cafe across from the East Gate at 4 o'clock. I hope you'll join me. I think your story is important." She walked away, leaving Thomas standing there with 1,000 questions. When his shift ended, he changed quickly and headed to the cafe. Rebecca was already there, sitting at a corner table with a notebook and a cup of tea. "Thank you for coming," she said as Thomas sat down. "I wasn't sure you would." "How did you know about my resignation?" Thomas asked. Rebecca smiled slightly. I have sources within the palace. But that's not important. What's important is why you're leaving. In my research, I found that you're not the first guard to resign recently. In the past 2 years, 6 other guards have left before completing their service. That's unusual. Something is happening, and I think it's worth exploring. Thomas had not known about the other resignations. Captain Reynolds had never mentioned them. What do you want from me? The truth. Why are you walking away from a position that most people would consider an honor? Thomas hesitated. Speaking to the media felt like a betrayal of the guard. But Rebecca's eyes were kind, and something about her manner made him want to trust her. So he told her everything. About Prince George and the water bottle. About the elderly man who stumbled. About realizing he had lost his humanity in service of tradition. Rebecca listened without interrupting, taking notes occasionally. When Thomas finished, she was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then she said, "You know what strikes me about your story? It's about kindness. A child showed you kindness, and it made you realize how much you had been lacking it, both receiving it and giving it." "I suppose that's true," Thomas said. "There's a larger issue here," Rebecca continued. "The Royal Guard is supposed to represent the best of British tradition. But if that tradition requires men to shut down their humanity, to ignore people in need, to become robots in fancy uniforms, then maybe we need to question whether it's a tradition worth keeping." Thomas felt uncomfortable with this direction. "I'm not trying to attack the guard. I'm just saying it wasn't right for me personally." "But it's not just you, is it? 6 other guards left. How many more are struggling silently? How many more have sacrificed their mental health, their relationships, their sense of self for this role?" Rebecca leaned forward. "Thomas, I want to write a story about this. Not to shame anyone, but to start a conversation about what we ask of the people who serve in ceremonial roles. Would you be willing to be interviewed on the record?" Thomas's instinct was to refuse. Going public felt dangerous, exposed. But he thought about the other guards who might be feeling the same way he did. He thought about the young men joining the guard every year, not knowing what they were really signing up for. He thought about Prince George and how one small act of humanity had changed everything. "Yes," he said finally. "I'll do it." The article appeared 3 days later. Rebecca had titled it, "The Human Cost of Tradition: Why Royal Guards Are Walking Away." It featured Thomas's story prominently, including his name and photograph. She had also interviewed James O'Connor, who provided historical context about how the role of the guard had evolved over time. A psychologist discussed the mental health impacts of jobs that require emotional suppression. The response was immediate and intense. The article went viral on social media. Some people praised Thomas for his honesty and bravery. Others attacked him viciously, calling him weak, disloyal, a disgrace to the uniform. The debates raged online and in the comment sections of newspapers. At the palace, the reaction was even stronger. Captain Reynolds called Thomas into his office, his face red with anger. "What were you thinking?" he shouted. "Speaking to the media about internal matters? You've embarrassed the entire guard. You've made us look weak." "I told the truth," Thomas said calmly. "I shared my experience. People deserve to know what this job really entails." "Your experience?" "Your experience is that of a quitter, a man who couldn't handle the pressure." Captain Reynolds slammed his hand on the desk. "You have 1 week left. During that time, you will not speak to any more journalists. You will not make any more public statements. You will serve out your notice quietly. Is that clear?" "Yes, sir." But the story had taken on a life of its own. Other guards, both current and former, began reaching out to Rebecca Walsh with their own experiences. More articles appeared, each one adding to the conversation. The palace released an official statement defending the Royal Guard and emphasizing the pride and honor of serving. But the public had started asking questions, and those questions were not going away. Thomas received dozens of messages on social media. Most were from people thanking him for speaking out. But some cut deep. One former guard wrote, "You've betrayed us all. We make sacrifices for something greater than ourselves, and you've turned it into a sob story." The criticism hurt, but Thomas also received messages that made it all worthwhile. A young man who had been considering joining the guard wrote, "Thank you for being honest. I thought something was wrong with me for having doubts. Now I know I'm not alone." A woman whose husband had served as a guard wrote, "My marriage ended because of what that job did to him. I wish someone had spoken up years ago. On his final day as a royal guard, Thomas put on his uniform one last time. The other guards barely acknowledged him. The camaraderie that had once existed, thin as it was, had completely evaporated. He was an outsider now, a traitor in their eyes. His final shift was at the east entrance, the same spot where Prince George had placed the water bottle. Thomas stood there for 4 hours, fulfilling his duty one last time. Tourists took their pictures. Children stared in wonder. An elderly couple smiled and moved on. And then, near the end of his shift, Thomas saw something that made his decision feel absolutely right. A young woman tripped on the cobblestones, dropping her bag, its contents spilling everywhere. She knelt down, trying to gather her things, looking embarrassed and overwhelmed. Thomas did not hesitate. He broke position, stepped forward, and helped her collect her belongings. "Are you all right?" he asked, handing her a wallet that had slid under a nearby bench. The woman looked up at him in shock. Yes, thank you. I'm so sorry. I'm such a klutz. Don't be sorry. These cobblestones are tricky." Thomas smiled at her, a real genuine smile. It felt strange on his face, like muscles he had forgotten how to use. Other tourists had stopped to watch, their phones out, recording the moment. Thomas did not care. He finished helping the woman, made sure she was steady on her feet, then returned to his position. A tourist from America called out, "You're a good man." That was really kind. Thomas did not respond, but inside he felt warm. For the first time in 15 years, he had acted on his human instinct to help someone. He had chosen kindness over protocol, and it felt right. When his shift ended and he walked away from his post for the final time, Thomas did not look back. He changed out of his uniform, folded it carefully, and placed it in his locker. The bearskin hat sat on the shelf above, looking down at him like a relic from another life. He walked out of Buckingham Palace as a civilian, just another face in the crowd. The weight of the uniform was gone. The expectations were gone. The rigid rules that had governed every moment of his day were gone. He felt lighter than he had in years, like he could finally breathe deeply. The first morning of Thomas's new life felt strange. He woke up at 5 o'clock by habit, his internal alarm clock still set to the schedule he had followed for 15 years. But there was no uniform to put on, no post to report to, no Captain Reynolds to salute. He lay in bed for a moment, staring at the ceiling, feeling both terrified and free. What now? The question hung in the air like a weight. Thomas had been so focused on leaving the guard that he had not made any concrete plans for what came after. He had savings, yes, but they would only last a few months. He needed to figure out his next step, and quickly. He got up, made coffee, and opened his laptop. The article about him was still generating discussion online. Videos of him helping the woman on his last day had spread across social media, with thousands of people commenting. Some called him a hero. Others said he had disrespected the uniform. The debate continued, but Thomas tried not to read too much of it. He needed to move forward, not dwell on the past. His phone rang. An unknown number. Thomas hesitated, then answered. "Hello? Is this Thomas Morgan?" The voice was male, professional, with a slight Scottish accent. "Yes, speaking. My name is Andrew Campbell. I run a charity called Veterans Transition, helping former military and ceremonial service members adjust to civilian life. I read about your story, and I'd like to meet with you if you're interested." Thomas felt a spark of hope. Yes, I'd be very interested. They arranged to meet that afternoon at a community center in North London. Thomas arrived early, nervous and uncertain. The building was old but well-maintained, with cheerful posters on the walls advertising various support groups and activities. Andrew Campbell turned out to be a man in his 50s with kind eyes and a firm handshake. "Thank you for coming," Andrew said, leading Thomas to a small office. "I know this transition must be difficult. Leaving the guard after so long, dealing with all the publicity. How are you holding up?" "Honestly, I'm not sure," Thomas admitted. "I know I made the right decision, but now I feel lost. I don't know who I am without the uniform." Andrew nodded knowingly. "That's exactly why I wanted to meet with you. What you're experiencing is completely normal. When your identity is wrapped up in a role for so long, losing that role feels like losing yourself. But here's the thing, Thomas. You didn't lose yourself. You're finding yourself. For the first time in years, you have the opportunity to discover who Thomas Morgan really is." They talked for over an hour. Andrew explained that his charity helped people like Thomas develop new skills, find employment, and most importantly, rebuild their sense of identity and purpose. He told Thomas about support groups where former guards and soldiers met to share their experiences and help each other navigate civilian life. "Would you be interested in attending one of our group sessions?" Andrew asked. "It's tomorrow evening." "No pressure, just come and listen if nothing else," Thomas agreed. The next evening, he found himself in a circle of chairs in the community center, surrounded by 8 other men. They ranged in age from mid-20s to late 60s. Some had been soldiers, others had worked in ceremonial roles like Thomas. All of them were trying to figure out who they were after leaving service. The facilitator, a former Army officer named Martin, encouraged everyone to share their stories. One by one, the men spoke about their struggles: depression, failed relationships, difficulty connecting with people, the inability to process emotions. Thomas listened, his throat tight, realizing that these were his struggles too. He was not alone. When it was his turn, Thomas spoke honestly about everything. The other men listened without judgment, nodding in understanding. When he finished, a former soldier named Robert spoke up. "Mate, what you did took real courage, not just leaving the guard but speaking publicly about it. You opened a door for the rest of us. You made it okay to admit that we're struggling." Others echoed the sentiment. For the first time since leaving the guard, Thomas felt like he belonged somewhere. These men understood him in a way his fellow guards never had. They had all worn different uniforms, but they had all paid the same price. After the meeting, several of the men invited Thomas to join them at a nearby pub. He hesitated, unused to social situations, but then accepted. They sat around a table, drinking beer and talking. Not about duty or honor or service, but about real things: families, hobbies, dreams they had given up and were trying to reclaim. Martin, the facilitator, told Thomas about a job opportunity. "There's a security consulting firm looking for someone with your background. Not standing guard, but actually using your brain. Risk assessment, security planning, that sort of thing. I could put in a word for you if you're interested." Thomas was interested, very interested. The next week, he interviewed with the firm. The owner, a former military man himself, had read the Guardian article and respected Thomas for speaking out. "We need people who can think critically, who understand that real security isn't about standing rigid and ignoring humanity. It's about being aware, being adaptable, being human." Thomas got the job. It paid less than the guard, but the work was engaging and meaningful. He assessed security for events, consulted with businesses, trained security staff. For the first time in his career, he was encouraged to think, to problem solve, to interact with people. His insights were valued. His opinions mattered. Months passed. Thomas settled into his new life slowly, like someone learning to walk after a long illness. He continued attending the support group every week. He reconnected with his mother, who he had barely spoken to in years. He started running in the mornings, feeling his body move freely without the weight of the uniform. He even went on a few dates, though nothing serious developed. He was still learning how to connect with people on an emotional level. One evening, about 6 months after leaving the guard, Thomas received an unexpected email. It was from the Princess of Wales's private secretary. His heart raced as he read it. The message requested his presence at Kensington Palace for a private meeting. No details were provided about the purpose. Thomas agonized over whether to go. Part of him wanted to refuse, to leave that chapter of his life completely behind. But curiosity won out. What could they possibly want with him? On the appointed day, Thomas dressed in his best suit and made his way to Kensington Palace. He was escorted through elegant hallways filled with portraits and history, finally arriving at a comfortable sitting room. A staff member asked him to wait, then disappeared. A few minutes later, the door opened. Thomas stood up automatically, his military training kicking in. But it was not the princess who entered. It was Prince George. The boy looked older than he had 6 months ago. Taller, more confident. But his eyes still had that same kindness that had changed Thomas's life. Behind him came Catherine, the Princess of Wales, smiling warmly. "Mr. Morgan," she said, extending her hand. "Thank you for coming. George has been asking to meet you for some time now." Thomas shook her hand, completely bewildered. "Your Royal Highness." "I don't understand." Prince George stepped forward. "I saw the videos of you online. The ones where you helped that lady who fell. Everyone was saying you broke the rules, but I thought it was really brave. You did the right thing." Catherine placed a hand on her son's shoulder. When George learned that his simple act of kindness had such a profound impact, he wanted to understand more. "We've followed your story, Mr. Morgan. What you've done, speaking publicly about mental health and the cost of rigid traditions, has been courageous." Thomas felt overwhelmed. "I never intended to cause any problems. I just needed to be honest about my experience. And that honesty has helped others," Catherine said. "We've heard from several guards who reached out for support after reading about you. You've started an important conversation about how we can honor tradition while also honoring the humanity of the people who serve." Prince George reached into his pocket and pulled out a small pin. It was a simple design, a water drop with a crown above it. "I made this," he said shyly. "Well, I designed it and someone helped me make it. I wanted you to have it, to remember that being kind is just as important as being brave." Thomas took the pin, his eyes stinging with tears he did not try to hide. "Thank you, Your Royal Highness. This means more than you know." They talked for nearly an hour. Catherine asked thoughtful questions about his transition to civilian life and his work with veterans transition. Prince George told Thomas about a school project he was doing on kindness and leadership. The conversation felt natural, human, real in a way that would have been impossible when Thomas was wearing the uniform. As Thomas prepared to leave, Catherine said, "Change is difficult, especially when it challenges traditions we hold dear. But sometimes change is necessary. What you've done has helped us think differently about how we can support the people who serve the royal family. Thank you for that." A year after Thomas left the Royal Guard, his life looked completely different. He stood in front of a room full of people at the Veterans Transition Community Center, preparing to give a talk. Public speaking still made him nervous, but he had learned to push through the discomfort. These people needed to hear his story, and he had found purpose in sharing it. "A year ago," Thomas began, "I was standing outside Buckingham Palace in a red uniform pretending to be a statue. I thought that was strength. I thought that was honor. But I was wrong. Real strength is being vulnerable enough to change. Real honor is having the courage to choose humanity over tradition." The room was packed. Former military members, current guards considering resignation, family members trying to understand their loved ones. Thomas spoke for 45 minutes about his journey, the isolation he had felt, the moment Prince George's kindness broke through his walls, the terrifying decision to leave, the difficult months of rebuilding himself, and finally the peace he had found in living authentically. After the talk, people lined up to speak with him. A young royal guard still in his first year shook Thomas's hand with tears in his eyes. "I thought I was the only one struggling. Thank you for showing me it's okay to question this path." An older woman hugged Thomas tightly. "My son was a guard. He took his own life 3 years ago. He never told anyone he was suffering. If someone like you had spoken up back then, maybe he would have felt less alone." Thomas held her as she cried, his own tears flowing freely. This was why he continued to speak publicly despite the criticism and controversy. If his story could save even one life, every uncomfortable moment was worth it. Among the crowd waiting to speak with him, Thomas noticed a familiar face. David Fletcher, his former colleague from the Guard, stood near the back looking uncertain. When their eyes met, David gave a small nod. Thomas excused himself from the conversation he was having and walked over. "David, I'm surprised to see you here." David shifted uncomfortably. "Yeah, well, I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about what you did. I was angry at first, really angry. Felt like you betrayed us. I understand that. But then something happened last month. My daughter, she's 8 now. She asked me why I never smile in family photos. She said I always look angry even when I should be happy." David's voice cracked slightly. I realized she was right. I've been so focused on being tough, on maintaining that guard mentality even at home, that I've forgotten how to be a dad, how to be human. Thomas put a hand on David's shoulder. "It's not too late. You can change." "I submitted my resignation yesterday," David said quietly. 15 years, just like you." Captain Reynolds was furious. Called me a coward, but I kept thinking about my daughter's face when she asked about the photos, and I knew I had to choose her. I had to choose my family. They talked for a long time. Thomas told David about the support group, about the job opportunities, about the difficult but rewarding process of rediscovering yourself. David listened, soaking up the information like a man dying of thirst. There's something else, David said. You should know that things are changing at the palace. Slowly but changing, they're implementing new mental health support programs for guards, regular counseling, time-off requirements. They even adjusted the protocol to allow guards to help someone in medical distress without breaking position completely. Thomas felt a wave of emotion.
Really?
Yeah. They didn't announce it publicly, probably don't want to admit you were right. But your story made them look at things differently. You changed the system, mate. You actually changed it. Over the following months, more guards began reaching out to Thomas. Some wanted advice about leaving. Others just needed someone to talk to who understood their struggle. Thomas helped where he could, always emphasizing that there was no shame in choosing a different path. Service could take many forms. Andrew Campbell, who ran Veterans Transition, offered Thomas a position as a peer counselor. The work combined everything Thomas had learned about himself with a desire to help others. He trained in counseling techniques while using his personal experience to connect with people who were going through similar transitions. One afternoon, Thomas received a phone call from Rebecca Walsh, the journalist who had first written about his story. I wanted you to know, the article we did has been nominated for a journalism award. It's in the category of public service reporting. They're recognizing how it started a national conversation about mental health in traditional service roles. Thomas was honored, but deflected the praise. You wrote it beautifully, Rebecca. You told the story with respect and honesty, but you lived it. You had the courage to speak up when silence would have been easier. That's what made the difference. The award ceremony took place at a prestigious hotel in London. Thomas felt out of place among the journalists and media executives in their expensive suits. But Rebecca insisted he attend as her guest. When their category was announced and they won, Rebecca pulled Thomas on stage with her. This award belongs to Thomas Morgan as much as it belongs to me, she said into the microphone. He trusted me with his story when doing so put him at risk. He chose truth over comfort, and in doing so, he helped countless others find the courage to do the same. The applause filled the room. Thomas looked out at the crowd, thinking about how far he had come from that day when Prince George placed a water bottle at his feet. That simple act of kindness had set off a chain reaction that was still rippling outward, touching lives Thomas would never even know about. 2 years after leaving the Guard, Thomas was asked to speak at a military academy about leadership and mental health. As he prepared his remarks, he thought about what he wanted these young officers to understand. They were at the beginning of their careers, full of idealism and commitment. He wanted to help them avoid the mistakes he had made. During his talk, Thomas spoke about the difference between strength and rigidity. True leaders, he said, create environments where people can be both disciplined and human, where service doesn't require sacrifice of your humanity, where asking for help is seen as wisdom, not weakness. After the talk, a young cadet approached him. Sir, I've been following your story since it first came out. I want you to know that you're the reason I'm reconsidering my career path. Not because you made me doubt service, but because you showed me there are different ways to serve, ways that don't require shutting down who you are. Thomas smiled. What path are you considering? Counseling psychology. I want to work with veterans and service members, help them process their experiences in healthy ways, be a bridge between military discipline and emotional well-being. That's excellent. We need more people like you in that field. The cadet hesitated, then said, Can I ask you something? Do you regret your 15 years as a guard? Thomas considered the question carefully. No, I don't regret them. Those years taught me discipline, commitment, the value of service. But I do regret that I let them cost me so much of my humanity. If I could go back, I would try to find balance earlier. I would seek help sooner. I would remember that being a good soldier or guard doesn't mean being an emotionless statue. On the 3rd anniversary of the day he left the Royal Guard, Thomas visited Buckingham Palace as a tourist. He stood in the crowd, watching a new generation of guards at their posts. They stood rigid and perfect, just as he once had. Part of him felt sad, knowing how some of them might be struggling internally. But he also felt hope, because things had changed. The support systems existed now. The conversations were happening. The silence had been broken. A small boy tugged on his mother's sleeve. Mummy, why doesn't he smile? The mother knelt down to her son's level. He's working very hard, sweetheart. His job is to protect this place and stand very still. It's not easy. Can we get him some water? It's hot today. Thomas smiled to himself. The cycle of kindness continued. He walked away from the palace through the streets of London, a free man living an authentic life. He had lost the uniform, but he had found himself. And in the end, that trade had been more than worth it. That evening, Thomas sat in his apartment, which now felt like an actual home with photographs on the walls and plants by the windows. He took out the pin Prince George had given him, the water drop with the crown. He had it framed, and it hung above his desk as a reminder of the moment that changed everything. His phone buzzed with a text from David Fletcher. "Group meeting tomorrow. You coming?" "Wouldn't miss it," Thomas replied. He was part of a community now, not a community built on rigid tradition and emotional suppression, but one built on honesty, support, and shared humanity. He had found his place in the world, not as a guard standing frozen at his post, but as a man moving forward, growing, helping others, and finally, truly living. Thomas thought about Prince George, now a teenager growing into his role as future king. He wondered if the young prince understood the magnitude of what his simple kindness had set in motion. A water bottle offered on a hot day, a few words of genuine concern. Such small acts, but they had changed everything. As Thomas prepared for bed that night, he felt something he had not felt in his years as a guard. He felt at peace. He had found his purpose not in standing motionless outside a palace, but in helping others find their own path to healing and whole.